Welcome everybody that is joining. We're going to get started in about a minute. As a reminder, at the bottom of the screen, there is a closed caption box. You can select that to show subtitle, and we have closed captioning provided today. So let's go ahead and get started. This webinar is being recorded. At the bottom of the screen, select CC to get closed captioning. Next slide, please. You are automatically muted. Please do not unmute. Put questions in the Q&A box below. We will answer questions either during the presentation or at the end of the session when we do question and answer Q&A. If we do not get to your question, we will email you as best as we can answer to that specific question. If you have any comments or things to share with others who are attending, please use the chat function. So for people who would like MCLE credit, it is required to take a survey at the end of this presentation. When you exit this Zoom, your browser will open up a tab in one of the internet applications that you have open. It will look like this little picture below. Select continue to fill out the brief evaluation. And we'd like everybody to give us feedback on, if the slides were readable, pace of speakers, about the subject and the content, to make sure that in the future we are providing you what you need and what helps you do your job. So it would be great if everybody could fill that out, but it is required from those seeking MCLE credit. And you will have to end the webinar to access it. And I will give an extra 5 minutes at the end of the webinar. Otherwise, I will end it. So today we are on our 5th training. We have 2 more sessions left. Next week, we will be covering disability rights and workers' compensation related to COVID-19. And then August 20th, we will have rights and recourse for workers during COVID-19. And we will have panelists from different legal aid organizations or worker advocate organizations joining us. Next slide, please. We've had both Jora and Nicole present as panelists, but they can introduce themselves again today for anybody joining us.
Hi, I'm Jora Chang. I am, my pronouns are they, them, she, her. I am the Chief of Staff and Equity at Worksafe. And I did want to remind people, since we have closed captioning, the presenters will be speaking at a kind of a moderate pace, as you have probably noticed, so that the closed captioner can capture everything that we're saying. We will be providing those as recordings for you later on.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Marquez Baker. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Director of Policy and Legal Services for Worksafe, and happy to be on this panel today to talk about these really important changes in the law.
So we wanted to give a little bit of background about Worksafe before starting. Our Worksafe's mission statement is preventing worker illness, injury, and death by bringing justice to the workplace. And we increase worker power, advocate for more protective laws for workers, ensure just treatment for injured workers, and raise awareness about occupational safety and health issues. Throughout the training, we will be referring to occupational safety and health as OSH. We engage in services such as legal support, policy advocacy, training, public outreach, create and share resources, and movement building. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I am going to roll out some polls to get a grasp on who is here today and what your background is. It helps us create the content that you would want as an audience. So, who do we have here today? I launched the screen or the poll and it should show up on your screen. Please let us know who's here today. Just a couple more seconds to get a few more votes in. Okay, great. So it looks like we have a lot of worker advocates and also other people. Feel free to share in the chat who you are if you'd like. We also have a few attorneys here as well. And then for background, we'd like to know what you have the most experience in related to the topics we will discuss today. Feel free to choose more than one. Let's have a couple more seconds to get a few more votes in. Okay. Looks like it's pretty split evenly throughout today, so that's pretty interesting. All right, well, thank you for participating in these polls, and the speakers will get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Karine. And thanks you guys for taking the poll. It really helps us understand, who we're speaking to. So today what we're going to cover is a review of hazards and hierarchy of controls. We're going to jump into wildfire smoke, the temporary standard, as well as the permanent standard. Then we'll talk about heat. We'll explain what heat illness is. We'll talk about outdoor heat, the proposed indoor heat, and the intersection with COVID-19. So I just want to remind you and also maybe introduce for those of you who haven't attended our prior trainings. We look at hazards as split into 6 different categories. So what we'll be talking about today will be physical hazards. It's going to be things that occur that are caused by the sun, for example, outdoor heat, and then things that may be causing indoor heat, such as electricity. That coincides with infectious biological COVID-19 issues. And so we'll see the interrelation later on as we, after we finish the presentation. And I also wanted to remind you to just kind of keep in your head as we're talking about this, because at the end we're going to circle back and talk about it even more. But in health and safety, we always want to think about a hierarchy of controls in order to protect workers in the best way that we can. And we like to do this through this depiction of a bullseye, but some people may have seen this as a triangle. When you play darts, you want to get right in the middle, and that is the elimination or isolation of a hazard. Right now, for example, we are trying to eliminate COVID-19 through isolation and remote working, social distancing. One thing to note on this is that the very least protective is this outer ring. This is where you don't want your dart to fall. And it's the one topic that we've all been talking about so much, which is personal protective equipment. This involves wearing masks, gloves, whatever it is that you need to wear to protect yourself against COVID-19, but it is the least effective because you're not eliminating COVID-19, you're not the coronavirus, that is, it is still present. And you are just kind of shielding yourself or shielding others from COVID-19 or coronavirus. So it is what we consider to be the least effective. We always want to try to find the most effective means of addressing hazards. So with that, I want to let everyone know that this particular training today is very poignant because it represents the intersection of climate change, all throughout the globe, we've been seeing rising average temperatures, and that has resulted in extreme weather patterns, some of which we'll be addressing today in terms of wildfire and extreme heat and its effect on workers. And so it's so very important to understand that none of this happens in isolation. There is a whole body of work issues going on that need to be addressed, including through environmental advocacy. We'll be focusing on worker advocacy. However, it's really important that we all work together through environmental justice with environmental advocates to ensure the most holistic approach possible. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole Marquez to talk about wildfire.
Thank you, Jora. So I'll be talking about the two standards that we have been working on in coalition with other partners, the Temporary Emergency Wildfire Smoke Standard and the proposed permanent standard to protect workers from exposure to wildfire smoke. So the origins behind this really, it's Jora mentioned, sits at the intersection of climate change. In late 2017, partners from the Central Coast and Northern California areas and Los Angeles that were very much impacted by Woolsey fires, the fires up in Northern California, and informed us that there were many impacts that they were seeing in terms of mostly immigrant workers, workers of color, many who were MAM or Zapotec speaking indigenous workers working in the fields or working as in the cleanup context of post fires, still being surrounded by smoldering and ashes and smoke, and not being provided with proper protective equipment, not being provided with any type of training on the health consequences of being exposed to wildfire smoke, and not being provided with any kind of additional breaks or schedule adjustments. So this really concerned us, and we petitioned the Standards Board along with our partners, California Labor Federation, California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation, to secure a temporary emergency wildfire smoke standard. And it's really centered in the AQI. So the trigger for the temporary emergency wildfire smoke standard is when the air quality index reaches 151, and it triggers a certain types of requirements from an employer. I will mention that before we had the temporary emergency wildfire smoke standard, we had all of this kind of confusion or lack of understanding of kind of workers of like what is my employer supposed to do, and employers kind of looking to the law and not seeing that like clarity of what they're supposed to do, which is arguably they were supposed to be doing much more, but that's another point. So we have the standard that is really couched in the air quality index. Next slide, please. And it looks at the fine particulate matter that's found in wildfire smoke, and it's the 2.5. This is a very, it's a mixture of solids and liquid droplets floating in the air. And the particulate matter is so fine, next slide please, that it can only be seen by with an electron microscope, and it's finer than a strand of hair. It can cause, once inhaled, has a lot of kind of can cause health impacts around kind of especially for folks who are already part of a sensitive work group, such as folks who have occupational asthma. This is a really, can worsen those types of conditions for folks. Next slide, please. And again, kind of the health effects of this fine particulate matter that's found in wildfire smoke is we'd see a lot of irritation of the eyes, the nose, a lot of some of these other issues. Again, for folks who are in vulnerable, sensitive groups, who many are the folks that are working in the fields, who already have kind of underlying health issues because of being exposed to pesticides or other kind of occupational hazards. You know, this is really exacerbated and creates a more kind of dangerous work environment when people are working in that type of environment. Next slide, please. So I would like to talk about the temporary wildfire smoke standard. So this standard, we petitioned the standards board for this temporary emergency wildfire smoke standard in 2018 in December. And it was originally slated to expire at the end of July, but because of COVID-19 and because of the executive orders that have been issued by the governor, this date has been extended to January 20th. 2021. And so we will have coverage of a law that says, but at minimum, an employer must do these certain things when the AQI reaches a certain level. So that certain level is 151 for PM 2.5, and that can be accessed via AQI, AirNow, monitoring towers. Some of the issues that we were seeing in 2019 are related to the towers not functioning properly because of the power outages. So we're hoping to see that employers they'll use predictive mapping to understand when their requirements are triggered. So at minimum, when the PM 2.5 AQI for PM 2.5 related to wildfire smoke reaches 151, an employer at minimum has to communicate to workers around kind of the health issues, any issues around reporting if they are feeling ill. Also communicate when the AQI reaches that level, right? So that way workers know what their employer is supposed to do, provide training on those health consequences, also provide training around how to properly don N95 masks. And the engineering and administrative controls, as Jorah had mentioned, if we're looking at that bullseye, the elimination, right, is the best one. It gets, you know, you're hitting right on the target. Engineering, if we remember, is on the next one, and it's really about changing the structure of your work. So employers are required to kind of do some due process, and if there are changes kind of structurally that they can make to the work, such as providing air conditioned filtration, so that way workers are you know, that creates a barrier between you and the hazard, then that first level of control is required. If that's not feasible, then they're required to move down to administrative controls, which looks like changing your work intensity, changing the location of the work, changing or increasing the amount of breaks that you get with administrative controls. And then the last and very kind of at minimum, employers are required to provide respiratory protection for voluntary usage when the AQI for PM 2.5 reaches 151. So that is kind of where the controls lie for the temporary wildfire smoke standard. We're seeing definitely, you know, the issues around COVID-19, and you know you know, we know for sure we will see wildfires in the future, and so we're already kind of seeing employers being resistant towards even this very, very least kind of protective measure. And so it's important for us to remember that these other controls are required by the standard, and really push for those more strong kind of protective controls. And then the last part is that when AQI for PM 2.5 reaches 501, so if we look back at that chart, 301 and 300 and 500 are when it becomes hazardous. And so when it goes beyond hazardous, then respiratory protection will be required with a fit test and a medical evaluation. So that's with the temporary wildfire smoke standard. Certainly, you know, what we're not wanting to see people work in hazardous at all in hazardous type of environments. And so it'll be really important for future kind of pushing to see that threshold is changed and reduced. Next slide, please. So for the permanent wildfire smoke standard, that is where we're really going to be fighting for, you know, changing those thresholds. So as I had mentioned, when workers are part of a sensitive population, if we look back at that AQI chart, when AQI for PM 2.5 reaches 101, it's already unhealthy for sensitive populations. And so what we would like to see in a permanent standard is that threshold be changed from 151, which is unhealthy for everyone, be changed to 101, right? So that way we are not leaving out and we're being mindful of the people that are doing work out and being exposed to wildfire smoke who already are a sensitive group. So that's one of the things that we're pushing for the permanent standard. The second part is that, again, for 501, really that is like beyond hazardous. And so what we would like to see happen, what we're pushing for is that it be changed to 301, and that when you're required to wear a respiratory protection, that and that it needs to be done with a fit test and medical evaluation, that requirement be triggered at an AQI for PM 2.5 at 301 instead of this 501 very hazardous type of situation. And then we really want to ensure that workers have accessible information about their rights. What we saw in 2019 with the fires, we saw a lot of folks not understanding what their rights were, not a lot of information being shared out on ethnic media. And this is really concerning, not a lot of kind of focus on kind of fact sheets or videos that are more accessible to folks who have lower literacy or low literacy skills. So really making sure that people know that this standard exists and that their employer is required to do these certain things when the AQI for PM 2.5 reaches a certain level, and that it's related to wildfire smoke. So next slide, please. And so now just wanted to, kind of, this is a call to action. We are in the process of the permanent rulemaking process. And so that step we're at right now is at the 15-day comment period. So essentially, and comments are due on the 12th of August, which is next week. Worksafe, along with our partners, will be submitting comments to push Cal OSHA to make sure that the permanent standard is as strong and as protective as it needs to be. And we will be sending out more information next week on how you can use a template letter that we'll provide, so that way you can submit comments and urge Cal OSHA to really make sure that they are centering workers experiences and ensuring that workers have the best type of protections and the most meaningful kind of rights when they are, you know, working and being exposed to wildfires. You know, it seems like, gosh, like it's just so long ago. Well, it seems like every year, right, there are wildfires. And so, not that it seems like it, there are wildfires every year, and it really is, it really is about, you know, connected to, as Jorah had mentioned, climate change and global warming. And so we are, you know, we don't kind of forget about those experiences, and we need to really make sure that workers are protected now and in the future. These health consequences that we know of now are things that you know, we can prevent the health consequences if we have standards that are protective and preventative and enforced. And so I'll leave it at that. Next slide. I think that's it for fire smoke standard.
Thank you, Nicole. So now I'm going to be talking about the outdoor and proposed indoor heat standards. There's a lot of information I'm going to be sharing with you. I want to remind folks that if you wanted a more in-depth training, we're available to do that. And also worker trainings, we have partners that we can collaborate with to provide workers training as well. So don't let all the information I'm about to give you feel overwhelming. So let's jump into it. Before I talk about the standards, I want to talk to everyone about heat illness. And this is so important because we are about to hit, and may have already hit, several heat waves. I'm up here in the Bay Area, and I know that in September we have some pretty vicious heat waves up here and across the state as well. So heat illness is a matter of life and death, and it is the leading weather-related killer in the US, more so than natural disasters such as hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods. So between 1992 and 2017, more than 815 workers were killed and 70,000 were seriously injured by heat stress. So making sure that there's preventative measures and that employers have timely and quick action can save lives. So what is heat illness? So everyone knows that the body normally cools itself by sweating. But in hot weather, sweating isn't enough, especially if it's humid. And I'm just going to use an example of if any of you have ever gone to a tropical area. So for me, I went to Vietnam last year, and I am from Vietnam, but I have not been there for many, many decades. I'm in the Bay Area, and for example, this morning I woke up, it was 65 degrees and it's summer. So I am not used to very humid and very hot weather. I went to Vietnam, and I was sweating all the time. So when you're sweating, you are cooling your body, and in high humidity, you sweat even more. And at the same time, because it's wet outside, because there's wet, the air is wet, you're not evaporating. Evaporation is what causes you to cool off. And so with humidity, it's even worse. So in Vietnam, I was sweating so much, but I felt hot, despite the fact that I was like pouring buckets of water, you know, because none of it evaporated. So body temperatures can rise to dangerous levels if precautions are not taken right away. Heat illness affects those who haven't built up tolerance enough. And so what I was talking about there was having not built up enough tolerance to be in Vietnam. That is something called acclimatization. It took me many months to say that the way I just said it. So don't feel overwhelmed if you can't pronounce it just that way. But acclimatization is a big, big deal, and we're going to be kind of stressing it a lot during this training. Most outdoor fatalities, 50 to 70%, occur in the very first few days of a worker engaging in a work process that they're just not, haven't built up the tolerance for under the certain heat that they're exposed to. This is one of the most common problems that's been cited by federal OSHA when they go out to do inspections. So what is acclimatization? The definition, temporary adaptation of the body to work in the heat that occurs gradually when a person is exposed to it. So it usually occurs for most people between 4 to 14 days of regular work for at least 2 hours per day in the heat. So I was in Vietnam for about 2 weeks. In my very first few days there, I was sweating buckets. By the end of my 14th day, I was sweating less and able to feel a bit more cooler. Then I left and went to, back to the States. But had I stayed longer, I would have been more tolerant of the kind of high humidity of Vietnam, the tropical area. So the best way to acclimatize workers is to gradually increase their work time in hot environments. Don't just throw them in there right away, but to start them off, for example, shorter shifts until they're adjusted to the heat, and do it over a 1 week to 2 week period. We often say do it in a week period if that worker has already kind of done that work, but maybe took some time off or has been, away doing something else for a while and has come back to it. But if the worker has never done that, a 2 week period is more appropriate. So these are just some guidelines about how best to do it. And we can kind of, if you have questions, please feel free to email us and we can chat with you more about that. It is a case-by-case basis depending on the work environment. So some risk factors for heat illness include personal factors such as medical condition, a worker's personal fitness and their age, also physical activity, like how much exertion are they engaging in the work that they're doing. Clothing is also a big issue, and especially under COVID-19, clothing is going to be a very important issue because everyone is wearing masks and maybe even gloves to prevent themselves from exposure to COVID-19 while at the same time working in a very hot environment. Levels of hydration are very important. Any kind of caffeine or alcohol could exacerbate situations. So I've heard of work environments where rather than water, employers are giving like high energy drinks. That is not a really strong way to hydrate workers. It can actually exacerbate heat illness. And also medications, prescription and over the counter. So heat illness occurs across the spectrum from less severe with heat rashes that might be little bumps on your body. And we're going to go through each of these. This may feel uncomfortable, having cramps as a result of being out in the heat. Like, I don't know if you've ever been out in the heat too long, you might feel your stomach cramping up or your muscles cramping up, to heat exhaustion and then heat stroke, which can actually result in death. So I'm going to be punching this hard a bunch of times throughout the training. You might see this slide again. It's so important that workers regularly drink water, not just when they're feeling terrible, but regularly throughout the day, that they rest in the shade when they need to, and that they don't feel prevented from doing so. And that if there are any symptoms of heat, that they have a method and a way to report that either to them, to their coworker or their supervisor as soon as possible, and that the supervisor and other coworkers know what to do if there is an emergency. So I'm going to go through each of these fairly quickly. We are sending these slides out to you, so feel free to look them over. But also, there are so many different guidelines that are out there on the internet. I know Cal OSHA has some to help you go through each of these. And they also have some multilingual materials for heat illness that are easily accessible from their website. So feel free to access those. So again, heat rash is like a little cluster of pimples or small blisters that might appear on the neck, upper chest, groin, under the breast, in elbow creases. The type of first aid that is recommended is to keep the area dry, change out of or get out of sweaty clothing, apply like a powder to increase comfort, but don't use ointments and creams. Heat cramps, again, is a muscle cramp or spasm in the abdomen, arms, or legs, and first aid would be to drink water or have snack or an electrolyte replacement every 15 to 20 minutes. Do not take salt tablets. Get medical help as soon as possible if the worker has heart problems, if the cramps don't go away in an hour, or if they're on a low sodium diet. So heat exhaustion includes feeling a headache, nausea, dizziness, weakness, irritability, thirst, having a fast heartbeat, a lot of sweating, elevated body temperature, decreased urine output, going to the bathroom, recommended first aid would be to remove the PPE to allow cool air to come, either moving the worker to an air conditioning or misting fan, definitely under some kind of shade, and giving liquids to drink. Cool the worker with cold compresses, or wet their head, face, and neck with cold water, and get a medical evaluation ASAP. Heat stroke involves confusion, loss of consciousness, hot, dry skin or profuse sweating, seizures, very high body temperatures, and it may be fatal. So get professional medical care as soon as possible. Move the worker to a shaded, cool area. Remove, again, PPE or any kind of body, anything covering their body that might be interfering with cooling down. Keep their head out of water, but give them a cold water bath if possible. Wet their skin, place cold, wet cloths on their skin. Circulate the air to speed cooling around them like a fan. Do not try to give oral fluids if the worker seems sedated or has slurred speech. So we're going to go in depth into some of these because they fall under the standards, but employers can prevent heat illness by having an injury and illness prevention program. Again, if you didn't join us for prior trainings, that is like a safety plan for a work site that addresses heat as a hazard. Frequent water breaks, providing shade and ample time to rest, to cool down. Implementing a buddy system. It's so important that workers do not work in isolation in the heat. And if they do work in isolation, that there is some form of communication that is constant, that the employer or somebody is monitoring that worker, and that the communication is effective. So for example, a cell phone in an area with no reception is not effective. The employer and other employees should be able to recognize signs and symptoms of heat exhaustion and heat stroke and know what to do when they see symptoms, and there should also be a plan for acclimatization for all employers. So PPE is a risk factor for heat-related illness, and that is because PPE covers parts of our body, whether it's you know, like gloves and a hazmat or a kind of suit, or just a mask that can prevent your body from cooling off. And so it becomes a really big concern, given that workers are, on the one hand, concerned about exposure to coronavirus, and at the same time, working under high heat situations. So we're going to talk a little bit about that at the end of this training. So I want to introduce you to a new way to measure heat, and some of you may know this already, but it is called heat index. A lot of times when we think about measuring the temperature, and a lot of workers have done this, is that they'll use their cell phone, or they'll use you know, like a regular thermometer to measure heat. But one thing that it doesn't take into account is humidity. So a temperature might feel like 90 degrees, for example. Here's an example. But if there's high humidity, it actually might feel even hotter on the body, over 100 degrees. And this is because, as I was saying, with high humidity, your sweat doesn't evaporate and doesn't cool you off as much. So as an example, I'm just going to go with, let's say outside it's about 98 degrees, but that you're in an area that has high humidity, such as 40% humidity. That temperature actually is around, the heat index is around 105, which falls into the danger zone here. As you go along with higher and higher and higher humidity, you get into extreme danger. So heat index is a particularly important way to measure heat, because it takes into account not just the dry bulb or the air temperature, but also the moisture in the air. Again, it's so important that workers drink, rest, and report symptoms early, and that this is just a regular part of the work environment or culture, not just something that people think about on a day that it's hot, you know, on a heat wave, but that it's a regular part of structuring work. So I'm going to talk about the Maria Isabel Vasquez Jimenez Heat Illness Standard, which is commonly called the Outdoor Heat Standard. But before that, let me talk to you about what brought this about. So the standard was first prompted in 2005 with the loss of 13 workers as a result of heat stress. The standard was passed as a temporary emergency standard in 2005 and then became a permanent standard afterwards. But that doesn't mean just because we have a standard that it's adequately enforced, and that's what happened in this case. The standard was not adequately enforced, and unfortunately, Maria Isabel died after pruning grapes for 9 hours in 100-degree heat. Her core body temperature became so hot, 108, that she collapsed in the vineyard. There was not sufficient medical response, and she died 2 days later of heat stroke. Maria was pregnant at the time, and it just created that a vast amount of outrage in the public health, occupational safety and health community, but also the public at large. So this refueled enforcement. The particular employer that she worked for, Merced Farm Labor, was shut down. The farm supervisors were charged with manslaughter and misdemeanors for failing to give Maria water, shade, and training and medical attention. Unfortunately, that case later on settled out with a plea deal, and the employers only being forced to serve community service hours. This is a picture of Maria's uncle at a protest for her. And the United Farm Workers were so outraged that they issued this following statement: "The life of Maria Isabel is not worth very much in the courts of justice of California. The government failed Maria Isabel at least 4 times, and it failed to protect the other 14 farm workers who died from heat since Governor Schwarzenegger issued the state heat regulation in 2005. So I tell this story because it's just so important to remember Maria Isabel, but also to remember all the workers who constantly toil in these conditions now. Notwithstanding the fact that there was poor enforcement in the first years of the standard, it was a model standard, as many California standards are. We just have to follow that fact with actual strong enforcement, which requires agency oversight and a lot of advocacy. And if you want to join us in that effort, please feel free to contact us afterward. So this covers outdoor industries, including agriculture, construction, landscaping, and any other industry where workers are outside. The employers have 4 basic requirements under the outdoor heat standard. The first, and very important, is to provide water. They have to provide water so that an employee can drink at least 1 quart, which amounts to 4 8-ounce glasses per hour. And the employer has to encourage drinking. They also must provide shade at all times and encourage employees to take a cool down rest in the shade for at least 5 minutes. That doesn't include the time that it takes to get to the shade. Hopefully that you don't have to move too far to get to the shade, but if you had to move too far, you didn't just waste it on getting there in the 5 minutes. Employees should not wait until they feel sick to cool down. Employers are supposed to develop and implement written procedures to prevent outdoor heat, and they must train all employees and supervisors. And I'm going to go into detail for each of these. So access to water. Employers must provide potable, which means drinking water, that is uncontaminated, that is fresh, pure, cool, and free. Do not charge workers at least 1 quart, 4 ounces a cup for the entire shift. And please provide cups to drink out of. We've had workers call us and say, there's a water cooler, but there's no cups. An employer provided that worker with a piece of paper and rolled it into a little, cone and said, drink out of this. That's ridiculous. You must provide something to drink out of. The water must be close enough and practical enough for the worker to access it, and it must move with the worker. And the employer must encourage frequent drinking of water for workers. Access to shade must be permitted at all times. Employees must be allowed and encouraged. So you keep seeing this word encourage. This is because of a battle which comes up often when we fight for these standards, where employers try to say, well, we'd like our employees to voluntarily, they can volunteer to do it or not, which brings in all sorts of problems with voluntary, the employee didn't volunteer to cool down, so this language is in there to mandate the employers to encourage workers to take a preventative cool down rest to prevent overheating. While they are resting, the employer must be monitoring them and asking them if they're having symptoms of heat illness. They must not be ordered to go back to work until the symptoms are gone. And the rest can't be less than 5 minutes. And that 5 minutes can't include the time it took to get to the rest area. They must be given first aid or emergency response if they have any symptoms. So we get kind of technical when we talk about before and after, and I mean, bigger or lesser than 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So don't get too overwhelmed by that. Just keep in mind that there are threshold levels. If the temperature is below 80 degrees, the employer should have shade available if the employee requests for it. And it shouldn't take like a whole day, you know, it should be readily available. If the temperature is above 80, they must have one or more areas of shade at all times, open to the air or with ventilation or cooling. And what that means is it's already set up. You know, in the first instance, it could be not set up but available. But if the temperature is above 80, it should already be set up and available. Employees shouldn't have to go and request it. It must accommodate all employees during rest and recovery period so that they all can sit in a normal position, like in, you know, normal chairs, sitting position, and they don't have to like crouch or anything odd like that. And they can do so without physically touching each other. And the importance of that, why that was fought for, is that you want to make sure that you have a large enough shade area to encompass all of the different workers in the area. The shade must also be close to the work site, and it can't be dangerous. So here you see a shaded area over some machinery. This is not an appropriate area. You know, the machine is taking up most of the area. When it's not feasible, employers can try to find other measures such as a misting machine if shade is not available. But again, Cal OSHA probably considers that on a case-by-case basis. If there's high heat, which is 95 degrees Fahrenheit or more, employers are required to implement a higher level of procedures, which again includes the effective communication by voice, observation, or electronic with an employee so they can contact a supervisor if there's an issue. They have to designate one or more employees who can call for emergency if there's an issue. Again, encouraging employees to drink water and take breaks. They have to hold a pre-shift meeting on prevention. If the temperature is above 95, there must be some kind of like, hey, wait, everybody, it's going to be really hot today. This is what we're going to do. There should be observation where a supervisor or designee is watching 20 or fewer workers or employees, or a mandatory buddy system, or again, regular communication if it's just one worker out there by themselves. If workers are working more than 8 hours, then they get an additional 10-minute break at the end of that 8 hours, and again in the 10th hour. So just keep that in mind. The procedures for the outdoor heat prevention should be in writing. It also has to be in a language understood by the majority of workers. So for example, if the majority of workers speak Vietnamese, it should be in Vietnamese. If the majority speak Spanish, it should be in Spanish. And it has to be made available upon request, a copy of that written procedure. The procedure has to contain all of the different issues that I've talked about so far. They also, employers must have some kind of emergency response procedure that includes effective communication, some kind of response to signs and symptoms of possible heat illness, and some kind of procedure for supervisors to take immediate appropriate action. This is insane. You have to include this kind of information in a standard, because if you don't, employers won't do it. But employers have to have a way to contact emergency medical services and tell them how to get to the site that they're going to. So this has to be written out in advance. You can't at that moment be trying to figure out how to tell the fire department or the emergency medical service to come to the work location. If there is a heat wave, so that the temperature is predicted to be at least 80 degrees or at least 10 degrees higher than it has been for the last 5 days, employers are required to closely observe employees during a heat wave. Every time you have new employees that are engaging in a high heat area or activity, they must be observed for the first 14 days of employment. And again, these are just some ways to acclimatize workers. Employee and supervisor training is so important. Supervisors must be trained before they can even supervise workers who work in high heat work. But the trainings involved understanding what heat illness is, what working hard, like physical exertion, what your clothes and what PPE may be doing to your body in terms of elevating your heat level. The training must involve all of the employer's procedures around water, shade, cool down, and high heat procedures. And it must tell the workers that they can engage in these rights without retaliation. There has to be information about acclimatization and the various signs and symptoms of heat, exactly the way that I've kind of told you in the beginning of this training, but much more in depth and not in like 5 minutes like I told you, you know, like longer in depth. And it should be repeated in my opinion. But the supervisory training also has to include how the supervisor is going to monitor the weather and how they're going to respond in the case of emergency. It's just amazing that some employers just don't think about this stuff ahead of time. And so it's so important that they have these procedures in place. So I'm going to talk about the proposed indoor heat standard that we've been fighting for. I'm gonna tell you a little story about it first. It started with a worker that Worksafe was representing named Domingo Blancas. And this is so such a great example of why you all are so important to us when you are engaging with workers and trying to protect workers. We at Worksafe can collaborate with you, partner with you to elevate these cases so that it takes the pathway that this did. So Domingos Blancas was a warehouse worker who was working in one of those metal distribution containers, you know, where things come in on a ship and then they're just full of things, items that need to be taken out mostly by forklift into a warehouse. And inside that metal container, which is kind of like surrounded by walls except for one opening at the very end where there's usually a forklift, you know, doing work. It was about 110 degrees inside that, and Domingo Blancas was sweeping that area when he started to feel heat illness and heat stroke, or heat illness, I should say. And he contacted his first employer, which was a temporary agency, and the employer was on site and said, "Hey, I'm feeling sick or ill," and the employer said, "Oh, I'm too busy, don't bother me with this, and go talk to the warehouse employer." So then he went to the warehouse employer, who then also said, "Don't worry, I mean, don't bother me with this, I'm too busy, you know, go talk to the temp." And so there's this back and forth with neither employer taking responsibility. So we've since then passed the law, working in collaboration with our partners, or a law has since passed that prevents employers from shifting blame like that. But back then, that's exactly what they were doing. So rather than being able to get help from anyone, Domingo Blancas ended up having to call his son, who then took him to it wasn't his son, actually. The first time it was another coworker. The second time it was his son. So this happened twice to him. He ultimately ended up in the hospital for 3 days and lived, but suffered severe symptoms and illnesses as a result of what happened, and he could have died. But in this particular instance, Warehouse Workers Resource Center, the Alexander Community Law Center, and Legal Aid at Work came together to represent Domingos Blancas in a Cal OSHA appeal that later on we won, but later on became the impetus to push for a law, SB 1167, which mandated the creation of the indoor heat standard, which we are now working on. And so it's like this trajectory that started out with one worker who was disenfranchised in this particular instance, but any one of your cases can be so important to changing the laws. So the industries that can be affected by indoor heat include warehousing, laundries, factories, bakeries, and indoor heat was the result of, or environmental heat exposure in an indoor setting to 37 work-related deaths in 2015. And the reason why it's that number is because that's when we have the data from. But they also resulted in 2,830 non-fatal occupational injuries nationwide. And so it's a very serious hazard. Can also be found in fires, those with fire service, those working with electrical utilities, or working in iron and steel mills. What we're asking for, again, you have, like this heavy focus on numbers, but it's important for you to know that certain temperatures are triggers within a work setting. So any work site that has 82 degrees or more Fahrenheit, so this is ironic because it actually can include your work site if you happen to work in a building, a worker center or whatnot, and you don't have like air conditioning inside and you're sitting during the heat. So it actually might apply to you as well. So all work sites where the temperature is 82 degrees Fahrenheit or more. And let me just remind everyone that this is a proposed standard. It's not law yet. This is what we're fighting for. And we're hoping to push Cal OSHA to pass this soon because the heat is getting pretty intolerable. But the triggers are either 82 or 87. 87 relates to either a heat index or a temperature. 82 is if you're wearing clothes and it's 82 degrees. And that's because we're taking into account the fact that your clothes might be making you even hotter. Or if you're working with a high radiant heat source, for example, a worker who's working with a fire or hot liquids or objects, their body's temperatures can heat up even more. Oh my God, I'm running out of time. So we're trying to ask for better provisions with the indoor heat. The outdoor heat standard is okay, but we want to make it even better and somehow take the outdoor heat standard with us in improving. So I want to give you some examples of what the bullseye looks like in a heat situation. Before this bullseye was for COVID-19, but now I've changed it to heat. So the type of engineering controls that you could do to help folks indoors is to, for example, insulate hot surfaces, shield them from workers from heat sources, use fans or coolers. These are like structural changes. Administrative controls include things like changing the schedule, scheduling shifts when they're cooler during the day. And personal protective equipment, there's actually personal protective equipment that can protect workers from heat, such as air-cooled garments, personal cooling systems. So we wanted to address the potential intersection of wildfire, heat, and COVID-19. And one thing we're hearing a lot, for example, is we can't provide PPE because there's not enough face masks if it's in this situation of wildfires. Or the PPE is actually making the workers hotter, and they're working within 6 feet of one another, but they're actually taking off their masks or they're taking off their gloves to touch the merchandise or whatever they're touching, and so potentially increasing the spread of COVID-19. There are administrative controls that an employer can take to mediate the situation, and rather than putting the onus back on the employee to do whatever, wear your mask, work within a 6-foot distance, the employer should be exploring avenues of either spacing workers out, scheduling workers at different times, scheduling less workers, rotating workers, or having environmental controls where you're separating workers so they're not exposed to COVID-19, but they're also like cooled by some mechanism as they're working, so that if they do have to take their PPE off, they're not exposing themselves or other people to COVID-19. So there are just so many things that an employer can do rather than blame the worker and say, well, they're not wearing the mask. I told them to wear the mask. It's just a lazy answer. So 12:59, I have talked your heads off. I want to remind you again of the importance of the intersection of all these issues, and that Worksafe is here to provide even more trainings for you, and these trainings more in depth. I'm going to pull Karin back because I think we're going to do an evaluation, but I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. Karin?
Hi, everybody. Yes, so we only have a minute left. If you had any questions, feel free to email us. I will put my email at the bottom of the chat, and so that way I can kind of moderate the questions and flag Nicole or Jora for any answers to those. Since we didn't really have time for that, you should click the X at the top. If you wait for me to end the webinar, it's possible you might not get the evaluation link. So I will allow for an extra 5 minutes starting from now, but as of right now, the webinar is now over. Thank you so much for attending, and we hope to see you next week where we will be discussing disability rights and workers' compensation intersected with COVID-19. Thank you.
And we have so many coalition work that's going on. If you want to join us, please email us.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.